thank you very much for your generous introduction, and to the Society for agreeing to include this talk in its programme of public lectures. I'm going to be talking today about the non-Catholic cemetery for foreigners in Rome, often known as the Protestant cemetery. It's been known under other names in the past, which celebrated in 2016 300 years of continuous operation as a cemetery. And for that we organised a small exhibition with the Casa di Goethe in Rome, concentrating on artists' views of the cemetery, because many artists came to draw or paint the place while they spent time in Rome, and some of them even spent all their lives and died there and are buried in the cemetery. I have three main aims, if you like, in the talk today. Looking at these artists' views, and of course the Pyramid of Gaius Cestius, which I will explain in a moment, which you see in the background, is one of the great ancient monuments of Rome, and that was one of the things that attracted artists to come and paint or draw it. But I'm going to be arguing that many of the depictions of the cemetery, and there are many, were not done simply as vedute, as views to be sold and possibly engraved and reproduced to be sold to visitors. Many of them were produced as keepsakes, as mementos of someone who had died there, and so they were done on commission. And so I'll be giving several examples of that during my talk. Another aim I have, briefly always, is to talk about the tradition in particularly the late 18th century and early 19th century, that the Protestant funerals always took place at night. And I want to explain a bit about our interpretation of why that was the case as it is now. And then thirdly, as you heard in the introduction, I shall talk a bit about specifically the graves of the two great Romantic poets, John Keats and Percy Bysshe Shelley, both of whom are buried in the cemetery, and how they have been visited over the years. So, and also just before I continue, I want to thank very much, I know many of you in the audience know the cemetery. I want to thank in particular those in the audience who are friends of the cemetery for your continued support of the place. Now, this place is the most beautiful cemetery I know, and I'm not the only person who says that. In fact, I am in good company, in that Percy Bysshe Shelley, when he was in Rome in 1818, the year before his own little boy died in Rome and is buried there, he said, "I think it's the most beautiful and solemn cemetery I ever beheld." George Eliot, visiting in 1860, again, she was of the same view, the most attractive burying place I have seen. She visited in particular the grave of Shelley and also the one of Keats, which left her in great pain at the sadness of the epitaph on his gravestone. And then bringing us a bit more up to date, Edvard Munch, the Norwegian painter, again, the same old words, is the most beautiful I have seen. So it's not just me, it's been the opinion of many visitors to the place over the years. Goethe himself, during his visit to Rome in 1786-87, also, just before leaving Rome, had the idea that if he were to die in Rome, he would like to be led past the monument of Cestius, the great pyramid, quietly down to Orcus. As we know, he didn't in fact die in Rome. I forgot to say that this is a lovely watercolour by Rudolf Müller, and the headstone you see on the right, the prominent one, is the grave of the son of Goethe, who died there in 1840. And in a way it's one example of what I shall be showing, that even though it's a lovely view of the cemetery, it's suggestive that it could have been done as a commission, not necessarily for Goethe himself, but for someone who was an admirer of him or his father. Just to remind you where it is, for those of you who don't know it, here's the station, the Vatican, centre of Rome. It's right down here, just inside the city walls built by the Emperor Aurelian in the 270s AD. So significantly inside the walls, right next door to the Pyramid of Gaius Cestius. What is this pyramid? The pyramid is the tomb of a Roman called Gaius Justius, datable between 18 and 12 BC. It's a monumental tomb which he himself said he wished to have constructed as his burial monument. We really know almost nothing about Gaius Justius apart from the inscriptions which are found on the pyramid itself and some objects that were found at the foot of it in excavations of the 17th century. Anyway, it's a monumental tomb, and probably not by chance that when the Protestants were allocated some space for burying their own in the city, it was right in front of what is already a tomb. You get some idea of the extent of the cemetery here. This is the old cemetery right in front of the pyramid with a few monuments scattered across the grass. And then the rest of the cemetery extends right up here. You can just see the tip of the chapel, which is 1898, and that is at the very end of the cemetery. It's 18,000 square meters in size. We call this the old cemetery in front of the pyramid, and then the rest is the new cemetery. I'll explain that distinction in a moment. Oh, and in the background is the hill, the Monte Testaccio, entirely artificial hill constructed of broken Roman potsherds from Roman times, accumulation of potsherds, but I mention it because it's a very common standpoint for artists who did views of the cemetery, including Turner. He went up there, and other artists whom we'll see later. So already in 1748, Nolli puts on his map of Rome this number here, which is the place where the Protestants are buried. So that's already in 1748. It's sufficiently important to be marked on Nolli's famous map of Rome. You also see the Monte Testaccio, which I've just mentioned, and the pyramid right there. But burials had in fact started there more than 30 years earlier. And this is the earliest known evidence for the use of this area for Protestant burials, a letter from a man called Roger Kenyon to the Duke of Marr in 1716. And William Arthur, who was a Presbyterian and a Scot, and a Jacobite, had fled to Rome after being involved in a plot in Edinburgh that failed, and very soon afterwards, after arriving in Rome, apparently he ate a surfeit of figs and died of dysentery. And his friend Roger Kenyon, his friend Roger Kenyon wrote that we had permission to bury him by the sepulchre of Justius, a favour to us sort of people, which clearly refers to people who are not Catholic, and was procured by means of Cardinal Gualterio, and you see him on the left. Cardinal Gualterio served as a kind of English ambassador to the Stuart court while it was travelling around Europe in exile, in France and then in northern Italy, and then very soon after this, 1725, he became the representative of the British community in Rome at the Vatican. So it was through him that, according to this letter, they were allowed to bury a Protestant inside the walls next to the pyramid. And only 7 years later, we have another example, James Graham, who was a visitor, a place designated to be the graveyard for the English, not the Roman Catholics, with the connivance of the government for the past few years. Other scholars of the cemetery have said, well, this letter of 1716, it could well not be the first reference. There could be references much, much earlier. But I would argue that especially this letter, which says for the last few years, that's 7 years after 1716, I think it would fit quite well. And also the phrasing of the 1716 letter, it's as if it was a new development. This was a favour to us. It's almost as if it was a new development. So I don't rule out there being found eventually something earlier than 1716, perhaps a little earlier, but to me that date seems fairly probable for the start of this activity. And it certainly wasn't going to stop us celebrating the tercentenary 2 years ago. So let's look at the plan as it is now. Here is the old cemetery in front of the pyramid, and there are about 60 graves from the 60 monuments from the late 18th century, early 19th. The first stone monument was not erected until 1765, so there were 50 years when only burials in the earth were made. And I stress that because even after monuments and stone started to be erected, we know that many, many people were buried there without a monument. Just to give you some examples of artists who were buried there, the English sculptors, John Deere, Christopher Gilbertson, and William Pars, the painter, we know were all buried in front of the Pyramid of Gaius Justice in the Protestant burial ground, but there's no trace of their burials. And in fact, there are dozens of, well, shall I say 30, 40 burials that we know of which do not have stone monuments, but which fall into this time span of the old cemetery. So what you see on the ground is only the reflection, a fairly full reflection, I will argue in a moment, of the stone monuments that were erected in that period. So this is the old cemetery, and then in 1822 the Pope insisted that all burials should cease in this area in front of the pyramid, and he would allocate instead an adjacent plot of land. And so in 1822 the new cemetery started right next door. So there's a huge contrast in atmosphere and location between the old cemetery on the left you see here and the new cemetery, which is the bit which is still active on the right. So just to explain a little more, here is the old cemetery in front of the pyramid, and you have the new cemetery laid out in 1822, and we have a description from a traveller that it was surrounded by this large wall, so we know quite a bit about how it was set up. And then the first extension, as space ran out in the 1850s, beginning from 1859, and then the second extension, the last extension, in the 1890s, and you remember I pointed out the chapel tip before, and so that is the full extent of the cemetery. Some of the graves I'm just going to be mentioning briefly today are this group just here, of Verpop, Groth and Reitzenstein. Here's John Keats, right in the corner down here. I'm also going to be mentioning, obviously, Percy B. Shelley. I shall mention these Scandinavians, or two Scandinavians, Blomer Knudsen and Howard. And I've already mentioned Munch, whose uncle is buried up there, and of course the son of Goethe is buried there. So those are just some of the very few of the monuments that I'll be mentioning today. And you probably saw that when the first extension was laid out with this triangular pattern, this is reflected very nicely in this woodcut by Arthur Blaschnik, where he shows the area which has been laid out with the triangular pattern of paths, but before any burials have been made. So even if the source does not date this woodcut, from archaeological evidence, from the historical evidence, we can usually date quite closely when these things were done. That's one of the great values of cemeteries, of course, that depending on which tombs are visible, you can date a view more or less fairly accurately. So the pyramid, as one of the ancient monuments of Rome, obviously a great object of vedute, of these views that were done for visitors in particular, and then sold once they'd been engraved in their hundreds. And so Giuseppe Vasi in the 1740s, he's taking a view from outside the cemetery going towards the gate of Porta San Paolo, and the cemetery is over the wall here, the other side of the pyramid. And of course, Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who did 4 different drawings of the pyramid, it obviously appealed to him. This is the 1750s, and you'll see detail in a moment, but notice here a fence, and that fence is to stop visitors from falling into the trench, which has been dug in front of the pyramid, because with the passing of time the earth would accumulate, and the entrance to the pyramid, which had been made in 1663 in a campaign by the Pope to revitalize the pyramid, would become blocked and inaccessible. And so every now and then you had the earth being cleared, and that's why there's this great big trench and a fence for safety reasons to stop visitors falling in. We will look at a detail in a moment, but just notice these figures here, because we will look at them in detail in a moment. But the tradition of doing vedute, these views, I mean, almost fossilized itself, it became very unoriginal in a way, because you just get this classic view of the tombs of the old cemetery in front of the pyramid. from the 1830s, again probably 1830s. Kotofavi's view is engraved and copied numerous times for decades after it. Once we get into the age of photography, again photographs were taken and then copied with permission, without permission, for decades and decades. But unusually we have this one by Flacheron, which is dated to 1852. And then we get into the postcard age, and Ernesto Richter, who produced hundreds and thousands of postcards. The same view again and again and again, framed usually by the corner wall of the new cemetery and the trees of the old cemetery, and then a view of various monuments, including this massive one to an Englishman called William Bowles, which dates from 1808. So very much a classic view, but as I say, what I'm arguing is that many of the other views of the cemetery are not just produced on a commercial basis, they do have other meaning. Now if we look again at this Pyrenees in more detail, you may not be able to see very clearly, but there are a couple of workmen down here shoveling earth around or doing something. These are two very well-dressed tourists who are either about just to go in or have just come out from the pyramid. And here you have a shepherd and a few sheep. Because this was open countryside. It was known as the meadows of the Roman people, and so it was open to grazing flocks of sheep and goats. So all the attention is on the cemetery, on the pyramid, and the entrance into the pyramid. But if we look at this, which is about 30 years later, by Volpato, what do we see? We see that there are two visitors here pointing in this direction, not towards the pyramid, and they're pointing to two people who are examining headstones in the Protestant cemetery. So a complete change of focus. Now it's these Protestant monuments which are of interest. And indeed remember I said the first gravestone is from 1765, and it's this grave of a young German from Hanover, so he had British connections too, Georg von Werpup. And then another one from 10 years later, Friedrich von Reitzenstein. And this lovely watercolor by Hackett shows visitors looking particularly at the graves of Reitzenstein and Werpup. Here they are today. And if we look at the detail, it's quite clear that it's the gravestone of Reitzenstein which is of interest. His name is spelled out, most of the inscription is copied, whereas Werpup's inscription is not portrayed. And so here's one of them deep in grief, and another two discussing, obviously, their memories of this man. We assume it was done, it's only an assumption, that it was done for a friend of Reitzenstein, or at least it's not just a view of the cemetery, it's definitely got meaning, and it's done with a particular purpose in mind of commemoration of Reitzenstein. This is a most famous view which happens to include the Protestant cemetery and the pyramid, the famous Roman elegy of Sablet. Still not clear who the two gentlemen on the left are. For a long time it was thought it was Jacques Sablet and his brother, and it was a kind of double self-portrait, but it's now known that neither of them look anything like Sablet, and so it was probably two other gentlemen in grief again over one of their companions, maybe a fellow artist, a fellow traveller, because I should have said as well, as the Protestant members of the Stuart court, right from the start, young men on the Grand Tour were also buried in the cemetery. So young travellers who died in Rome, young artists who had come to Rome to get experience there, they were also, right from the start, buried in the cemetery. But what is of equal interest to me, anyway, is what is shown in the background here. If we look at the detail, we see again the graves of Reitzenstein and Werpup behind it. A little shepherd boy playing a flute, and another shepherd here. But there's a third tomb now arrived. This is 1791, and it's the tomb of a Russian called Guilhermus Grota. And what is interesting is that we know that Sablet had left Rome in 1793. His painting is dated to 1791. Grote only died in April 1791, and his brother's request to erect the monument to him is not until late October. So Sablé managed to somehow to do a painting which is dated independently to 1791. I would guess perhaps that the request was put in after the monument had already been done. The monument has the arms of Grote on it, so it was a special commission. It wasn't something simply bought from the stonemason for erection there. Anyway, so a little puzzle there, but it is definitely dated to 1791. So from those early years of the old cemetery, now in the 19th century, we have a couple of engravings, of etchings, which depict all the monuments which are visible to the artist from his viewpoint at that time, and the artist very helpfully in the caption has identified who they are. And both in this and the next one, all of them identifiable today. So essentially, we could say with some confidence that all the monuments we see today existed at the time, because they are listed in these captions, and as I was saying, the whole old cemetery was closed in 1822, and with a very few exceptions during the 19th century and early 20th, that's how it has remained until today. And so these two etchings of 1811 and another of 7 years later, again, a different view, but with all the monuments identified, are very valuable in confirming that what we see today in terms of stone monuments is more or less what existed in the early 19th century. Now we get to this controversial question of why were all these Protestants buried at night. We have many descriptions of funerals taking place of these young foreigners, young artists. Their fellow artists were described going down to the pyramid, but always at night. James Boswell was in Rome at the time that this young German, George Verpup, died and was buried in 1765, and he wrote in his diary that he was buried at night because the prejudice against Protestants was so strong that the authorities refused to allow daytime interments there. So it's seen as discrimination against the so-called heretics. Several scholars of the cemetery have argued against that on good grounds, but it's still something which recurs again and again in texts about Rome of this time or about the cemetery. So let's look at this claim. We have several depictions of these night burials taking place. This is by Pinelli. It was engraved after his death, 1840. But it's based on a watercolor which is dated 1831, which there are very good reasons for thinking, at least in form of preliminary sketch, has its origins much, much earlier, if only because after the cemetery was closed in 1822, these funerals no longer took place in front of the pyramid. So Pinelli must be basing this on an event which is before 1822, and there's an argument to say that it in fact dates from 1811. We have in fact 5 depictions of these night funerals, and the first one goes back to 1767. We usually don't know who it is who's being buried, or in the case of these 2 Swedish depictions, we know who was being buried, and in only one case do we know who it might be done by, who it's attributed to. In the other case, we don't know the artist. So there's an imbalance in the evidence there, but the important thing is the content of the depictions. I said this was a private collection, but in fact it comes, as we know now, from a volume in the British Museum, I think only in the British Museum, Raccolti di Vedute, dated to 1767. Peter Stevens, we know, was an artist who was in Rome and Florence between 1753 and 63, and we don't know who is being buried. One possibility was the artist Jonathan Skelton, who was a friend of Stevens, we know that, who died in 1759. But the title given to the engraving is suggestive: Funeral of a Protestant Gentleman. And others have seen a possible reference to a Protestant member of the Jacobite Stuart court, but Stevens did not want to disclose that he had actually witnessed a Protestant funeral at the cemetery, and so he left it as anonymous like that. Anyway, it's dated to 1767, and it shows wonderful details of the carriage waiting here, which has brought the coffin. They're carrying the coffin here towards this grey area, which is the open trench, and this is an earth pile from the trench that has been dug, and various people are standing on the earth pile to get a better view. And some of these spectators are certainly Romans, they're not friends and family, and we know from the written accounts, eyewitness accounts of these funerals, that many, many Romans, friends of the artist, friends of the person who had died, would come and take part in these ceremonies. So a very important earliest one, Jacques Sablé, again, not dated, but we know he left Rome in 1793, and again, if we look at the detail, here is the monument to Reitzenstein, his name is on it there, and there's the one of Verpup behind. So again, nice confirmatory evidence, but of course it doesn't date it other than being later than 1775, but before 1793. We have two depictions of this burial of a young Swedish artist called Jonas Åkerström. And we have a long account of it too, because the son of Piranesi, Francesco, was the Swedish agent in Rome, and he asked his brother Pietro to write an account of this funeral so that it could be sent back to Stockholm. And we have that, and we have a list of all the artists who came to the funeral, many Italians as well as foreigners. And so lots is known about this funeral. And what is intriguing is that you see the circle of mourners. This is probably, again, the Grote sarcophagus that we saw earlier, and the coffin, unusually with a cross on it, which normally wouldn't have been allowed, and on the left, one carriage. But 3 months later, or a few months later, we have another depiction of the same, probably by this Swedish artist Jövel. And instead of the carriage, he has put in two monuments which look exactly like those of Reitzenstein and Verpup. So he must have known the cemetery, he must have gone back there, he added in the trees, he changed a few details here. So he must have been familiar with this earlier one, the one that had been sent to Stockholm, and went back there, for reasons we don't know, to do his own just a few months later. So we know a lot about the funeral of Åkerström. So what about Boswell's assertion that they were all held at night because of prejudice against the Protestants? I would say that Boswell had a misunderstanding, shall we say, essentially because all funerals took place at night. Catholic funerals took place at night, Jewish funerals took place at night, Protestant funerals took place at night. Just to take one example, this Frenchman Thomas, who seemed to have been fascinated by funerals and death, he has many, many drawings of processions and this rather graphic depiction of a burial in the Borgo Santo Spirito. He was in Rome 1818, and taking place at night. And then, I'm sorry, we've gone the wrong way. He has many other drawings. These are lovely watercolors, his original watercolors, which are now in the Museum of Rome, showing these processions all carrying their torches, and all the descriptions of the time of Catholic funerals, like the Protestant ones, talk about them taking place at night. The only major difference was that in the case of a Catholic burial, the body would go to the church, as you see on the left there, and would stay there for 24 hours before then going to burial, whereas in the case of the Protestants, they had to take the body from the house of the deceased straight to the cemetery. So, but apart from that difference, the principle was the same, and in a hot climate it makes sense to carry out these activities during the night anyway. So I'm not the first historian of the cemetery who has claimed this, others have too, and I hope it will gradually enter the peripheral literature too, that this was not prejudice against the Protestants. There are many examples of tolerance of the Protestants, as I say, these Romans who attended funerals, and many, many other indications of a general atmosphere of tolerance which prevailed at the time. I'm not going into detail now, but just by putting all those 5 images together, we really get a very good idea of how these were conducted. The torches, the circle of mourners around the grave, this unusual depiction of a cross in the case of the Swedish one, the coffin being carried towards the grave or being put into the grave, The spectators gathered around. You see these young lads climbing up on the Grote monument to get a better view. Clearly young Romans, not members of the family. And the preacher. It's not commonly recognized that the papacy allowed the Catholic Stuart court with its Anglican members to have an Anglican preacher on staff. And Anglican services were held in the palazzo which the Stuart court occupied. And as long as there was an Anglican preacher in Rome, which there was until about late 1760s, he would conduct these services at the Pyramid. After that, it was usually some distinguished member of the foreign community, a writer, a poet, a statesman, whoever happened to be in Rome and could take the service. So are they other veduti commissions or are they veduti for sale? This Danish view, young artist, Christian Holm, known as the animal painter, particularly in Britain, we know that this was commissioned by his family 20 years after he died. He died in 1856. And it still is in the possession of the family, who visit Rome frequently, and as recently as a month ago. This also, another Danish artist who died there. When the grave slab is a simple, flat, horizontal ledger, it's very hard for the artist to make something out of it. So in this case, Lesser has done an overall view of the cemetery, and we know that this was on commission, and it still belongs to the family in Denmark. Again, Lesser again. Blomer just recently married and then died of tuberculosis in 1953. Again, done for the family, and his wife took it back to Helsinki. And the only painting that Edvard Munch did during his time in Rome in 1927 was a view of his his uncle's grave, the great historian, Peter Munch. So again, done for family reasons on the spot in Rome. And again, we have Russians. Again, commissions, we assume. There's simply the same view seen from different sides. This grave and this grave, that grave and that grave seen from the other direction, one looking towards the pyramid, the other looking towards Monte Testaccio, and Lebedev has allowed himself to insert the pyramid there completely out of position, but just for compositional purposes, which allowed him also to include this heathen monument here and the dome of St. Peter's in the distance, so as to combine the two in the same view. Artist license. The Swiss painter Salomon Korody, again, he had very close relations with the Russian court. He really did nothing but commissions for the Russian court during the 1840s, and we can assume that this was a commission for the family of the Princess Tchaikovskaya, and this probably also a commission of someone recently buried looking towards the pyramid. Thomas Cole, subject of a great exhibition at the Metropolitan at the moment and will be in the National Gallery this summer. We know that he did this view from Monte Testaccio of the cemetery as it was then, before an extension. And we know that he offered it to a man called Isaac Hone, whose brother had died and was buried in the cemetery a few years before. In fact, Isaac Hone turned it down because I think he felt too uncomfortable with this reminder. John Linton Chapman, another American, and we know that he was, his patron was related to this young girl, Sophia Howard, of 29 years old, and so we know that this also was probably done for the Howard family. Now we get to the two poets, the same John Linton Chapman, with this beautiful diptych, which we assume was done on commission for someone visiting Rome and wanted a view of both poets' graves. That's not for sure, but we know that the following year, 1863, Fanny Keats, his sister, visited Rome. Joseph Severn introduced her to the Chapman family, John Linton Chapman and his father, John Gadsby Chapman. She saw this painting and she said she would love to have an engraving of the view of Keats's grave, which was done. And so this was done by the father, John Gadsby Chapman, of Keats's grave after the watercolour. There are a few examples of that known, one of them in the Wellcome collection here in London. So, John Keats, as you know, died 1821 of tuberculosis, looked after by Joseph VII, and Percy Bysshe Shelley drowned in the summer of 1822, and his ashes actually buried in January 1823. Now, I've understood that, at least amongst literary scholars, it took time for an appreciation of the graves of the two poets to develop. In the case of Keats, for instance, particularly not until Monckton Milnes published his first biography of Keats in 1848. And Shelley, in a way, his reputation took much longer to recover from his reputation of being this atheist and radical thinker, and probably only late in the century that his reputation was renovated. Be that as it may, we can demonstrate that from the earliest days, from the 1820s, we have visitors going to their tombs. On the left, and we'll see again later, this is from 1875, when there'd been a major renovation of Keats's grave. People had complained that it was not in good shape, and it was put on a new base, which elevated it considerably, new curbstone, younger box bushes around it, and this is a contemporary photograph, maybe 20 years later, of the grave of Percy Bysshe Shelley. And they were frequently painted during the 19th century. Just examples of Walter Crane's painting, where it's very difficult to show that flat slab, and he's done an overall view of the niche in the tower where the grave is. You can just see it there. Whereas William Bell Scott, getting nearer, allowed himself to elevate it, and even reproduced quite a lot of the inscription, because otherwise it simply wouldn't be visible. And so he has allowed himself to elevate it in that form. And both these artists also painted the other poet, John Keats's grave, Crane here and Bell Scott here. Crane very faithful in the way he depicts other monuments, which can be seen today. Bell Scott much more inventive about what he shows, but has been very careful in reproducing the whole inscription very carefully. Now, Walter Crane had been commissioned to do these two views of the graves of Shelley and Keats by George Howard, later Lord Carlisle, who was a great amateur painter himself. And so it comes as rather a surprise to find that within the same few years, a little bit later, because the trees have grown, we have George Howard doing his own watercolour of the grave of Keats. Why would that have been? And the answer is, just after Crane and Bell Scott had done their watercolours, there was the project of renovation in 1875, which changed the appearance of the grave, and that's why it's much more elevated here, much more visible, and the hedges are lower. So presumably Howard thought, I now want a painting of what it looks like now, and so he did his own. This is the earliest known depiction, or was until recently the earliest known depiction of the grave of John Keats, with the distinctive lyre, L-Y-R-E. When I said that this is where they lie, I meant, of course, where they rest. The lyre on the top of the gravestone, done by David Scott, a young Scottish painter who died very young. And in the background, he shows the cypress trees planted in front of Shelley's grave, planted by Edward Trelawney in 1823. We now know, by chance, this is not in fact the earliest depiction, because just last year there turned up this drawing by a Frenchman who just arrived in Rome as one of his first works. He clearly had difficulties getting the sides of the pyramid straight. But what does he show here? He shows the grave of Keats with the lyre and the letters Y-O-G, Y-O-U-G, which is clearly an attempt at young English poet, which is in capital letters on the gravestone. Okay, it's by chance that Joinville showed it, but this is sometime in 1824, and we know that Joseph VII, working with the sculptor Joseph Gott, didn't manage to complete the headstone for Keats until June 1823. So it would have been sitting there, bright, shiny marble, and would have been very evident to the artist coming along to do a sketch, which, significantly, Joinville entitled The Cemetery of the Protestants. He didn't call it View of Pyramid of Chestius. So by chance, it shows the grave of Keats. And then Shelley scholars apparently have thought that it was only late in the century that his grave became of interest, but not at all. We know from early on, for instance, Walter Savage Landor visited in 1826, only 3 years later. Arthur Hallam, the friend of Lord Alfred Tennyson, visited 2 years later and wrote a sonnet on each of the graves. Of course, once they get into Murray's Handbook in 1843, then they become a must-see for all visitors. And we have many, many accounts. John Ruskin, Charles Dickens, George Eliot, all of them visiting the graves of the two poets. It was the main attraction of the two different cemeteries. So Henry James, too, who loved this place, and you can tell from his prose that he's completely transported every time he goes there. And there were these commemorations in Rome by Italian scholars of Shelley, for instance in 1892, and William Rossetti in his Reminiscences tells a great story about this wreath that was put on his grave, and this is the first time I think it's been recognized. This is the wreath that was put on his grave by a number of Italian Shelley lovers in 1893, and then a few years later, other Italian Shelley lovers who are not identified, but we have an idea who they were, tore it off the grave and threw it away, as disapproving strongly of this particular type of homage to the poet. So the commemoration of his birth in 1892, and then commemoration of his death in 1922, another ceremony taking place, and on the right you can see all the great and the good who were taking part. You have the Mayor of Rome, the British Ambassador, the Director of the Cemetery, correspondent of the Times, all gathered there to commemorate Percy B. Shelley. So a long tradition of, right from the 1820s, of visiting their graves and organising these commemorations. And I think that changes slightly the way that maybe some of the literary scholars have seen the heritage reception, as they say, of these two poets. And we've seen Pinelli before. We know from Selina Martin in 1820 or so that Pinelli was a frequent visitor down at the cemetery, always accompanied by his two mastiffs, and he allowed himself to put on one of the stones here, tutto finisce, everything comes to an end, and so does his lecture. Thank you very much.